This paper is about two philosophers, and especially the second one, Fakhr al-Razi. Just as a quick kind of introduction, Ibn Sina is the thinker a lot of you may know as Avicenna. So he lives from the 10th to the 11th century CE, and he's the most important philosopher of the Islamic tradition, and his works are extremely influential, among other reasons, because he inspired a lot of philosophers later on to respond to him. A lot of you will know about Ghazali's Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers, in which he attacks Ibn Sina's positions. I'm going to call him Ibn Sina, by the way, because that's his real name. Avicenna is the Latin translation of his name, but I think it's increasingly common to just call him Ibn Sina and expect people to know who that is. So this paper is a kind of sequel to a chapter I wrote for a volume I actually edited back when I still called him Avicenna, in fact, called Interpreting Avicenna, Critical Essays, in which I talked about the strategy that Ibn Sina uses to prove the existence of God. And as you're going to see, my argument was that he has a kind of two-stage strategy to establish the existence of the God who is worshipped in Islam. Now, Razi is famous for a number of things. So among them is what you're looking at is actually the spines of part of the edition of his Tafsir Kabir, his great commentary to the Quran. This is not even all of the volumes of it, as you can see from the fact that the numbers start at 3, right? So this is volume 3. Actually, it's not a complete row, but this is some of his commentary on the Quran, which is something that Muhammad Rustam has worked on quite a lot, the whole tradition of Quranic commentary, one of our organizers today. But in addition to that, something he's very famous for, he also wrote on jurisprudence and on kalam, and he wrote numerous works in which he responds to Ibn Sina, either by commenting on Ibn Sina. For example, his commentary on the Pointers and Reminders is a work by Ibn Sina, Isharat wa Tanbihat, and then a whole series of systematic works on what you might call philosophical theology. And those are the works I'm really going to be drawing on here. So the general point I want to make is that al-Razi responds to Ibn Sina's philosophical theology and agrees with it to some extent. So in particular, he agrees with the idea of establishing God as the necessary existent, which is something I'll explain in a second. But then he tries to sort of correct what Ibn Sina is doing to avoid certain consequences that he doesn't like from a theological point of view. In particular, he wants to avoid saying that everything about God is necessary. So the kind of take-home message of everything I'm about to say is that whereas Ibn Sina thought that everything we know about God is bound up with God's necessity, Fakhr ad-Din thought that God's existence is necessary, but other aspects of God are up to God's will. And what we're going to see is that he develops a whole theory of divine attributes, which is designed to make that conclusion possible. Okay, so first let's have a quick look at what Ibn Sina does in proving the existence of God and also the nature of God. So in that other paper that I pointed out, or that I already alluded to, Ibn Sina discusses God in 2 stages. So the first thing he does with his famous so-called proof of or demonstration of the truthful, Burhan as-Siddiqin, is to prove that there is a necessary existent. I guess I won't go through the proof. A lot of you will know it already, and it actually won't matter so much for what I'm about to say. But the basic idea is that he says, well, everything in the universe around us is only contingent, which means it might exist or it might not exist. So by its own nature, it's compatible with existing, it's compatible with not existing. And it can't be that everything is like that, because we need something that preponderates merely contingent existence to actually exist. So if you think about the way that they often think about this is that something that is only possible or contingent is like a set of scales, which needs to be balanced or tipped in the balance one way or the other by a cause to make it exist rather than not existing. So this is why I, for example, exist. I could have failed to exist, but I do exist. Why? Well, because some cause caused me to exist. In fact, necessitated me to exist. And the idea would be that God is the ultimate cause that makes everything else exist. And in order to avoid saying that he also has a cause, we say that instead of being contingent or merely possible, he is necessary. Okay. Now, this first stage only gives you that result. So all it does is to show that there is some necessary existent. That doesn't even tell you that there's only one necessary existent, right? Because there could be a cause that causes everything else to exist, but there might be another one just like it, or there might be an infinity of necessary existence. Or maybe the necessary existence isn't the god worshipped in Islam, but is something else like Zeus, right? So there needs to be a second stage of argument where he shows that various traditional divine attributes can be sort of extracted from the notion of necessary existence. So, for example, he proves that there's only one necessary existent by arguing that if there were two, then there would be something needed to distinguish them. And whatever distinguished them would cause them to be different from each other, but the necessary existent can't have a cause, right? And he uses this kind of argument to prove a whole series of divine attributes, all the traditional divine attributes that we expect God to have, like powerful, knowing, wise, generous, and so on. However, this is really important for everything that's going to follow. For Ibn Sina, these divine attributes, which are implications of God's necessity, are not, as it were, positive characteristics or features that belong to God. They're always either negations or relations. So, for example, saying that God is one, wahid, so this is the Islamic doctrine of tawhid, oneness. Saying that God is one just means denying that he's multiple. In other words, denying that there's more than one necessary existent. Or to say that God is powerful refers to a relation that he bears to the universe, but there are no positive intrinsic features of God. There's only negations and relations, according to Ibn Sina. And one of the points that I make in this paper that I wrote earlier is that when he's in the first stage of the argument, showing that there is a necessary existent. So as I said, we at this stage, we know very little about the necessary existent, right? We don't even know that there's only one necessary existent. Never mind that he's powerful, good, generous, knowing, wise, etc. In fact, Ibn Sina at this point sort of raises the possibility that the universe itself is uncaused. So the universe is just here as maybe just a brute fact that the universe exists. And so the universe would be, in a way, the necessary existent, right? And in fact, you could imagine someone saying this, like, for example, Aristotle might have thought something like this, that the universe is eternal and just necessary. There's no reason the universe is here. In fact, Aristotle never even raises the question of why the universe exists. And Ibn Sina says something really interesting to this in passing. He says, well, if someone said that the universe exists necessarily, in a way, that is what is to be shown. Because at this stage, he's only proving that there's a necessary existent, right? It's only in the next stage that he'll say, well, the necessary existent can't be the universe because it has to be simple, immaterial, and so on. That these are implications of its necessity. And actually, I thought I was very clever to have pointed this out, this kind of feature of Ibn Sina's argument. But it turns out that Fakhr al-Razi already noticed this and so this is one of his early works, the Mabahith al-Mashriqiyya, where he says, some people believe that for establishing the reality of the necessary existent, one also needs to establish that the world is contingent, rather than necessary. This is not so. Rather, we may be satisfied by what has been mentioned above, if among existence there is a necessary existent, the goal of the proof has already been achieved. That's the first stage, right? Then, when we thereafter undertake to enumerate the attributes of the necessary existent, it becomes evident at that point that the world, given the substance and accidents in it, is no necessary existent, but rather among the effects of its existence. So here actually, Fakhreddin is basically saying exactly what I argued in my own paper a few years ago, and I hadn't read this passage yet. So I was really surprised when I found this passage and realized that he had already anticipated everything I said in my paper. So great minds think alike, I guess. Okay, so here's what al-Razi is going to do. He likes stage one. So he thinks that Burhan al-Siddiqin, he has various questions that he raises about it, but basically he thinks that it works and that you can use Ibn Sina's proof to establish that there is a necessary existent. But then he says, well, now we need to talk about the divine attributes. And although they might have some kind of relationship to God's necessity, we're not going to have the result that all of the attributes are only relations and negations. And we're also not going to rule out that God is a voluntary agent. You can see why Ibn Sina would think that God is not a voluntary agent, right? Because he thinks the only way you know anything about God is to infer God's attributes from his necessity. So obviously you're not going to be able to infer from necessity, from divine necessity, the idea that God can arbitrarily make decisions, right? Because arbitrarily deciding between multiple alternatives sounds incompatible with necessity. So obviously not a consequence of being necessary. So effectively what Razi wants to do here is accept Ibn Sina's grounds for thinking that there is a necessary existence, but then find other grounds for ascribing other attributes to God, including God's voluntary will. So it's really interesting to kind of compare how he handles the whole problem of sort of constructing a philosophical theology. So you have these very Avicennian divine attributes listed in various works, but then you also find him rejecting things like the principle that only one effect can come from God, the unity principle, the idea that God only knows particulars, the idea that the universe is necessarily a product of God and therefore eternal, and so on. And there, a lot of what's been written about Fakhreddin by other people has sort of pointed out these disagreements with Ibn Sina. So my point is really that there's a kind of underlying central idea in Fakhreddin's whole philosophical theology, which is that although he does, as I say, like the idea that God is a necessary existent, he doesn't like the idea that all of divine attributes are just grounded in God's necessity. That's really what he, so basically to make a long story short, what he's doing is accepting stage one of Ibn Sina's argument and rejecting stage two. So this strategy begins with a really key part of his philosophical theology, which is to show that God's essence is distinct from his existence. So that's kind of a complicated idea, but the basic thought here is that it goes back to what I was saying before about what it is to be a contingent thing. So as I said, I'm the sort of thing that might exist or might not, right? So it's like a set of scales that is in balance and needs to be tipped one way or the other. And if a cause makes me exist, then I have been sort of preponderated to exist. And Ibn Sina and Fakhreddin take this to show that my essence is neutral with respect to my existence. So my essence is open to existing or not. Sorry, I left out his last name here, but there's a nice paper by Fedor Benovich where he argues that for Ibn Sina, there's just no difference between God's essence and his existence because he's the necessary existent, right? And one reason why Ibn Sina would want to say that is that if you say that God's existence is distinct from his essence, like mine is, then you would have some kind of composition in God, right? You'd have two things. You'd have what God is and the fact that he exists, just like there's what I am and the fact that I exist. The fact that I exist is kind of external to my essence, like it's something added to my essence, you might think. Whereas that's not true for God. In God, essence and existence are the same thing. But remember, for Ibn Sina, all attributes are either negative or relative, right? So even the fact that God exists necessarily for Ibn Sina would ultimately be a negation. It would be that he exists without having any cause or something like that. So really all there is in God is his existence. So God's essence is his existence, according to Ibn Sina. So Peter Adamson says about this, Razi accepts that necessity is a relational attribute because necessity always renders a relation between a subject and a predicate. This, however, serves him not to deny composition of God, but to establish it by proving that God has a quiddity apart from the necessity of existence. It's the relationship between God's essence and his existence that is necessary. So this is explaining how Razi differs from Ibn Sina. So as I said, I'll go back to the previous slide. So whereas Ibn Sina says that God's essence is his existence, as Peter Adamson says, for Razi, God's essence implies his existence. So there's actually two things here. The existence is kind of outside the essence. And people often think about this as showing that that Razi has a kind of what you might call a realist position about existence. So existence is a real thing which attaches to God's essence. But actually, Razi, when he talks about this, he also says, well, you have to admit not just that God has existence, but also that he has an essence, which is something that in Ibn Sina isn't so clear, right? So again, the point is that for Ibn Sina, in God, essence and existence are just the same thing. But for Razi, you show that God has an essence and that God's existence is implied by that essence. So there's some kind of duality at the level of God. And he argues for this explicitly. So, for example, in his last work, the Matalib al-Aliyah, he has separate sections on God's existence and his essence or quiddity. So he tries to show that God's quiddity is not, or essence is not just existence. Rather, he has a nature, an essence, which implies his existence. And in that respect, God is just like us, right? So he has an essence and a separate existence. The only difference is that whereas our essence does not imply our existence, God's essence does imply his existence. So as he says, God is that whose quiddity is most deserving of existence, and it's a subject of which existence is predicated. So he's very clear about this. Maybe an analogy might be that existence relates to God the way that, for example, having internal angles equal to 180 degrees relates to triangle. So the essence of triangle guarantees that its internal angles are 180 degrees. And in the same way, the essence of God guarantees his existence. Whereas that's not the case for us. So my essence doesn't guarantee my existence. It doesn't rule it out either. I'm contingent, right? I could exist or not. But something has to cause me to exist. Whereas God just exists in his own right. Now, this is a famous bit of Razi's philosophical theology and has received quite a bit of discussion in the secondary literature. But so I'm not like the first person to point out that he's making this move. My point is rather that this is actually the first step in a kind of longer strategy where he wants to show that there's a whole bunch of features that are positive features which belong to God. So he's rejecting the idea that everything about God is either negative or relational. Rather, we have what he calls thubuti attributes, so positive or affirmative attributes, which are sort of outside the divine essence, but belong to the divine essence. And in order to get this result, he's obviously departing from a really strict view of divine simplicity. So whereas Ibn Sina would say God is nothing other than his own existence, and there's nothing more you can say about God apart from negations and relations. For Fakhr al-Razi, there's some kind of conceptual distinction between God and even his existence. Never mind his other attributes like power, knowledge, wisdom, justice, goodness, and so on. And this is clear in his own discussion of divine unity. So, I mean, obviously, Fakhruddin accepts the principle of Tawheed, right? So he thinks he takes himself to be a good Muslim who agrees that there's only one God and that God is in some sense simple or unified. But he rejects the view that he ascribes to Ibn Sina and his followers, the philosophers, like the falasifa. He rejects their view that, as he puts it, the essence of the creator cannot be described by any of the positive non-relational attributes, for either those attributes are necessary in themselves or they're not. And then he kind of gives an argument, which maybe I won't go through just to save time, for how they would rule out these options. But the point is that they want to say God has no positive attributes. And he says, yes, God does have positive attributes. And in a sense, existence is one of those attributes. He actually, in a nice work that I'm going to draw on a lot in the rest of the presentation, he sort of sets out the way that people make mistakes when they're thinking about divine attributes. And he says this: the reason for people's confusion when it comes to affirming and denying attributes is down to two premises which capture their minds in a dilemma. The first premise is that unity is a perfection and multiplicity an imperfection. This premise leads one to exaggerate in respect of Tawheed, or God's unity, to the point of denying the attributes. So that's one side of the dilemma. The other side of the dilemma is the premise that God exercises power over all objects of power, knows all objects of knowing, is living, wise, hearing, and seeing, and this premise leads their minds to affirm these attributes. So obviously, in the first half of the dilemma, he's thinking of the falasifa. So he's saying these people are so determined to secure the result that God is one that they just deny the reality of the attributes. Another group of people who could be described here are the Mu'tazilite theologians. So there's a dispute within Islamic theology or kalam between the Mu'tazilites and the Ash'arites. The Mu'tazilites believe in divine simplicity and are usually very reluctant to accept any positive attributes. The Ash'arites endorse the reality of positive attributes. And so Fakhruddin is siding with the Ash'arites against Ibn Sina and the Mu'tazilites. There's a nice example of how he handles this. So remember I said before that for Ibn Sina, God is one, just because if there were two gods, then there would have to be some cause to differentiate them, right? So Fakhruddin has a really nice and somewhat technical discussion of why God is in fact one individual. And he says, well, what Ibn Sina says is that God doesn't have any individuating feature, because if God did, then it would be a cause for him, right? So he has to deny that God's individuation is thubuti, right? But then Fakhruddin says, well, maybe individuation is just negative, right? So being an individual is just not being any other individual, in which case you could have more than one necessary existent, right? Because you wouldn't need any cause to differentiate them. But for Ibn Sina, individuation would have to be positive, so it would have to be an additional feature of God, which he doesn't want, right? So what would Fakhruddin say about this? Well, he says, sometimes he says it's not clear whether individuation is a positive feature, but sometimes he says that God's essence is going to imply his individuation, just like God's essence implies his existence. So the idea here is that the divine essence implies certain things about God. So as we've already seen, it implies that he exists. And now he's suggesting that the fact that God is one and is the individual that he is implied by God's essence. So there's a pattern emerging here. And the pattern is, whereas Ibn Sina says God's essence, if he has one, is just his own existence, and there's nothing else positive you can say about God intrinsically. Fakhr says, no, you've got the divine essence, and then you've got all of the traits of God that are implied by the essence, and these are kind of external to the essence, at least conceptually. So again, a good analogy here would be the fact that triangles have 180 degrees internal angles. That's implied by by the essence of triangle. It's not identical with the essence of triangle. It's an implication of it. And in fact, there's a technical term in that al-Razi takes over from Ibn Sina here, which is lazim. So lazim means something that's implied or something that's concomitant. So it follows from something else, right? And you can use this word in normal Arabic to mean something fairly non-technical, like it follows from something that such and such. You can say lazim for that relationship. But he's going to use this in a very technical way and say that the lawazim, or concomitants of God's essence, are just all of his positive attributes. So, and we've already seen some of them, right? So God's existence is a lazim of God's essence. In other words, it's something implied by God's essence. God's unity is implied by his essence. God's individuation is implied by his essence. And you can see this is a pattern that he's going to now expand on. All of the divine attributes for him are going to be lawazim, so things that are implied by God's essence, and they're not going to be identical to God's essence. So this is kind of ironic because he's using a concept from Ibn Sina, this notion of concomitance, in order to depart from Ibn Sina's really strict kind of Mu'tazilite style view on divine simplicity, which denies that there are any positive attributes. So that's Ibn Sina's view. For Fakhr, there are positive attributes, and they're precisely attributes that are implied by God's essence. Let's take another example. So this is a much discussed example in Ibn Sina, divine knowledge. So you might wonder, well, how in the world is Ibn Sina going to show that God has knowledge, given that the only thing we can say about God is somehow derived from his necessity, right? So why would necessity imply having knowledge? Like there doesn't seem to be any relationship between those two concepts, right? So the answer turns out to be that Ibn Sina argues as follows. If God were made of matter, then God would depend on the matter from which he is made. So the matter would be a kind of cause for God, right? It would be something on which God's existence depends. But God is the necessary existent. There is no cause on which he depends, right? So God can't be made of matter. Therefore, God is immaterial. And we know from Aristotle's philosophy that an immaterial substance is an intellect. So the only activity that can belong to an immaterial thing is thinking, because thinking is an immaterial activity. So this implies that God is thinking and therefore is an intellect. So that's how we know God is knowing. Okay, so that's Ibn Sina's arguments for divine knowledge. So you can see like how much work he has to do to ascribe all of these traditional divine attributes to God, right? Because all he's got to work with is the notion of necessity. And he's got to kind of extract every single divine attribute out of the notion of necessity. And the way he does it in this case is by saying, well, the necessary is uncaused. Something that has matter would be caused by the matter. So something necessary can't have matter. So it's an immaterial entity, and anything that's immaterial must be able to think, right? This is quite an indirect and maybe not very convincing argument. So now Fakhr, after explaining this, says, well, there's a problem here, which is that according to Ibn Sina, to think is to receive a kind of form in the mind, which corresponds to the thing that you're knowing. So, for example, if you have knowledge about giraffes, then you're taking on in your mind the form of giraffe. And it looks like these forms that God would take on would have to be distinct from the essence of what is known, right? And so we're going to have composition in God after all. So an alternative here would be for Ibn Sina to say, well, maybe God's knowledge and the objects of his knowledge are just like his existence. They're just identical to his essence. But then al-Razi says, well, that contradicts their own theory of knowledge, which is that knowledge is the occurrence of the form in the knower, right? And he kind of makes fun of this in another work. He says, they claim that for God to be intellect and intellected is negative because it comes out to the negation of matter, right? So his intellective nature is just a consequence of being immaterial. And then he says, but this is an amazing thing for them to say because they make knowledge equivalent to the occurrence of a form in the knower, which corresponds to the object of knowledge. How can they equate this to the denial of matter? So you can see what he's trying to do here is catch Ibn Sina in a kind of dilemma. So on the one hand, Ibn Sina only wants to allow negations and relations of God. On the other hand, knowledge doesn't look like a negation in Ibn Sina. It looks like possessing a form, right? So actually what he should say, says Fakhr, is that knowledge isn't the possession of the form of the object of knowledge in the mind. It's just a relation because he allows for relations between God and other things. And then Razi says, well, sure, that would be a good view, but of course that's not your view. It's our view that, we Islamic theologians, the Mutakalimun, we think knowledge is a relation. You think it's having a form in your mind. So you have to either drop your negative theology or drop your theory of knowledge. And you can already imagine what he's going to say about divine knowledge. It's an attribute through which God is related to the things that he knows, right? Because remember, unlike Ibn Sina, he's perfectly happy for there to be positive attributes in God. The attributes are implied by God's essence. So for him, knowledge is an attribute. So the Arabic word, by the way, for attribute is sifa. So it's one of God's sifat. It's a knowledge which connects him to many objects of knowledge. Or he also says God's knowledge of things is relational and external to his essence. So, whereas Ibn Sina, according to Fakhr, can't really explain how God could have knowledge because Ibn Sina can't really say that knowledge is a negation, nor does he think it's a relation. For Fakhr, knowledge is an attribute which sets up a relation that makes God knowing of other things. Yet another example, and these are really important because they have to do with whether God has free will, right? So this is the question of God's power, his kudra. So here, basically what Ibn Sina would say about this is that God is powerful just in the sense that everything else derives from God, right? Because he's the necessary existent who causes all of the contingent things to exist. And that would be a relation. So that's fine. That's compatible with his philosophical theology. But Fakhr doesn't like the idea that God has to create the universe, right? So actually here the word lazim comes up again. So if the world just follows from God like a necessary implication, then as he put it, God will not be acting by choice. And actually he says something really strong about this, stronger than he says in most of his works. And the Lalami, which is this treatise about divine attributes, he says that denying God's choice, free choice, is the position of the philosophers which undermines Islam. And of course, this is connected to the issue of whether the universe is eternal or not. So the philosophers think that God has to generate the universe and that the universe is therefore eternal, right? Because whenever you have God, you have the universe, and you always have God, so you always have the universe. Whereas Fakhr wants to agree with the standard Kalam position that God freely chooses to create the universe. So if he's going to say that, then of course he has to explain how it could be that God's capable of making decisions between alternative possibilities. And the way he does this is to again use his theory of attributes. So just as God has these other attributes we've looked at, like unity, individuation, existence, and knowledge, so God has kudra, so power, and it's in virtue of that we call him the powerful, al-Qadir. And he says about this that something that's powerful can preponderate one of two objects of his power over the other without any further preponderator. So that's kind of technical, but the idea here is just if you're capable of making a choice, if you're free or powerful, then you have these two options and you can just pick one over the other, right? So you can imagine this in a human case, like you're deciding whether to have strawberry ice cream or chocolate ice cream. You just decide to have strawberry ice cream and there's no further explanation or anything. There's just a decision, right? It's an arbitrary decision, perhaps. Like you really like both kinds of ice cream. You could have picked either. You decide to pick the strawberry just kind of by an act of will. And the same thing is true of God. If it weren't, then he wouldn't be powerful. He wouldn't be qadir. He would be necessitating. In other words, the universe would just necessarily follow from him. And by the way, he also thinks that in order for God to be powerful, it's not enough that God can freely choose between possibilities. He also has to have knowledge because he has to knowingly decide between the possibilities, right? Okay, so now we've seen a whole bunch of attributes that Fakhr ascribes to God. So we've got existence or existent, maybe, would be one attribute. One, wahid, powerful or power, kudra, knowledge, ilm. If you have knowledge, you could also think, well, he also has wisdom, right? Because he has perfect knowledge, so hikmah, and so on. And what you could go on to talk about other attributes like benevolence or goodness, generosity. Right? So, okay, but you get the idea, right? So the basic idea is, whereas Ibn Sina has this extremely simple God who's just pure existence, about whom we can only to whom we can only ascribe negations or relations. For Fakhr, you have the divine essence and then all of the attributes that essence implies, which are kind of external, in a sense, to the essence. And I think this is important because it makes room for contingency. So on the one hand, the individual attributes are, as we've seen, lawazim, so they're concomitants of divine essence or necessary implications of the divine essence, if you want to think of it that way. But since they're external to God's essence, they can put him in a relation with other things, which is contingent. So he has this power through which he can decide between two open alternatives. For example, the alternative whether to create the universe or not. So he can just decide. Why? Well, because he has power, which is an attribute, a positive attribute. And what is power? Well, it's nothing more or less than the ability to choose between possibilities. Or we have God, his essence, and then divine knowledge, which is an attribute by means of which God knows lots of different things. So he's basically allowed for some level of multiplicity at the level of God, rather than having this really simple version of God that we have in Ibn Sina. And the advantage of that is that it's going to allow him to say other things he wants to say about God, in particular that God is a voluntary agent and that he knows everything that exists in the universe. So one thing you might have been thinking this whole time, this is, by the way, of course, is a picture of God's divine names, right? And you may have been thinking, oh, these attributes that I keep talking about, these sifat, are presumably just the same as God's names. But actually, that's not right. So this text that I have been citing from, the full name of it is Lawami al-Bayanat fil Asma wa Sifat. So it's about the like clarifications about God's names, his asma, and his sifat, his attributes. And in this treatise, he says, well, actually, a name, an ism, is different from an attribute, a sifa. A name refers to the thing itself and its essence or its true reality, whereas a sifa, an attribute, as we've been seeing, is something implied by the essence. right? So one way, another example would be like if you call me Peter, that's not some feature that belongs to me. It's just my name, right? And when you use a name, you're just referring to the thing in itself. So you're directly targeting the essence. You're not describing some attribute that belongs to the thing that has the name. So as he says, every quiddity may be considered either as such or as designated by a given attribute, and the former is the name, the latter is the attribute. And again, he says later in the same treatise, the name provides nothing but the essence, which remains obscure or unknown, whereas the attribute conveys the qualities of the quiddities, providing knowledge of their true natures in detail or in an articulated way. So what he means here is that everything that we can kind of say about God to describe him is an attribute. But if we name him, we're just naming him in himself, which means his essence. And we do have both names and attributes for God. And he refutes other philosophers and theologians who, for one reason or another, think that we can't ascribe any names or attributes to God. We've just seen, right, that he thinks that Ibn Sina and his followers can't ascribe attributes to God, right? Because he has no positive attributes according to them. But for Fakhr, we do have both names and attributes for God. The thing is, though, that the only reason we have any names for God is that we get them from revelation. So just as you might, like, when you meet me, you have no way of knowing what my name is unless I tell you, right? So similarly, we only know God's names, like Allah would be a good example, because he tells us what his name is, right? And he tells us that in Revelation. Whereas the attributes are things that we can work out using reason. He says that this, by the way, is a position on which he agrees to Ghazali. So it's actually a very interesting passage from the Nawami where he says, among our companions, and he must mean Asharite theologians, the Master al-Ghazali has opted for the view that the names are accepted according to divine permission, while the attributes are not accepted by permission. And this is the preferred view. In other words, this is the view I accept. When he says that the attributes are not accepted by permission, he means that you can work them out using reason. So you don't need God's permission to use them. So when he talks about God as like transcendent and ineffable, what he means by that is really that God in himself is unknowable. So God's essence is unknowable. And in a sense, the philosophers would be right to say that God, as it says here in this quote, God in his core, in what he is inconceivable for humans. All that humans may know about God, the exalted, are negative and relational attributes. And the essence, insofar as what it is not an object of human knowledge. So he says, well, in a way, they're right, because the essence in itself is nothing. It's sort of like a black box, right? We don't know his essence. His essence is ineffable. But good news, the essence implies a bunch of attributes like power and knowledge and existence and oneness, and those we can know, right? So this is the difference between the attributes and the names. The attributes are positive consequences of his essence, of his unknowable essence, and names are just designations for the unknowable essence that were divinely revealed. And I think that this actually tells us something important about Razi. I mean, this is only one philosophical issue, but I think it's interesting to see here, sort of, as it were, the extent to which he's a theologian and the extent to which he's a philosopher. People often call him a philosopher theologian. And I think that's right. And this is a good example because he thinks you can do a lot with reason, but you can't do everything. It's basically the difference is that you can use reason to figure out his attributes, but you can't use reason to figure out his names. And for that, you have revelation. And in this, I think he really, at least in the Nawami, he takes himself to be a follower of Ghazali in this respect. It's certainly not always true that Fakhr agrees with Ghazali about everything, but on this, he's very critical of Ibn Sina. He, as I said, he likes the proof for God's existence as the necessary existent, but he doesn't like the necessitarian theology that comes from that. he wants to have a God who is freely choosing, who knows through an external attribute of knowledge, through which he's related to us, and so on. So we have in this part of his thought really a kind of sophisticated defense using Avicenna materials of a fundamentally Asharite theological position. And in this respect, he's very much like Ghazali. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Adamson. That was wonderful. So we have a lot of questions actually, and I'll pose. Yeah, I'll pose them to you, and feel free to answer as long as you like, and then we'll move to the next one. So, in the first, in Ibn Sina's view of God as the necessary existent, continuously sustaining all things, can this be read as allowing a mystical sense of divine immanence, that God is present in everything?
Well, so I think it depends on whether you're asking what Ibn Sina himself would say or what other people would do with his ideas. Mm. So as far as what other people would do with his ideas, obviously, yes, right? So there, in fact, and Muhammad could say more about this than I can, but there's this long running tradition of philosophical mysticism, which runs from people like An al-Qudat al-Hamadani, author Muhammad's published about, or al-Kunawi, down to Mullah Sadra. And what they would say is, oh yes, Ibn Sina is right that God is just existence. But then, unlike Ibn Sina, they would say that there is no other existence other than God. And so what we grasp when we grasp existence is God himself, and we somehow grasp the unity of all things with God. So that would be basically a philosophical explanation of what happens when mystics have this experience of unification with the divine. What they're getting is a kind of intuition of the unity of all existence with pure existence, which is God. So in a sense, that's very Avicennan, right? Because Ibn Sina did think that God is pure existence. But it's also very un-Avicennan because Ibn Sina would also have said that there's contingent existence. And in fact, contrary to popular belief, basically Ibn Sina doesn't have a mystical bone in his body. So there's a couple of passages where he kind of alludes to some Sufi mystical terminology, but he seems to be a deeply rationalist philosopher who thinks that when mystics have mystical experiences, they're just basically having these kind of unifications with higher principles, which you can much better understand if you explain them philosophically. So he's really not mystical at all. But nonetheless, his metaphysics was used to kind of justify mystical positions later on.
Excellent. Thank you. Another question is, how important are such discussions like this now, especially since Islamic philosophy and theology have gone over and above them, especially after Mullah Sadra and Mir Damad, and how they have reinvented the question of quiddity and existence. In addition, how important is it now in a modern sense, even outside of the Islamic domain of thought?
Yeah. Okay. So I think it's important in a couple of different ways. One is that it's important historically, right? So basically everyone who works on these issues after Ibn Sina is somehow shaped by his discussion of this, right down to, even beyond Mullah Sadra, right? So, if you think, well, this isn't so important because hasn't Sadra kind of gone beyond all this? Well, no, actually what Sadra is doing is taking one position within a range of positions that remain open once Ibn Sina has raised the question, right? So it's almost like saying, well, all I need to know about is Sadra because his position is the most sophisticated or something. But you have to realize that Sadra is just taking a position within a range of possibilities that are all within the Avicennan framework, right? So it's sort of like saying, well, now that we have, now that I know how to make this one chemical compound, why do I need the periodic table? Right? It's not really a meaningful distinction. So that's one thing. And also the other thing, by the way, maybe historically, is that just as these issues get taken up in this Arabic and also Persian tradition, they also got taken up in Latin. So Ibn Sina is sort of at the nexus of where the later Islamic tradition goes and also where Latin medieval Christian philosophy goes, because people like Aquinas are aware of all this, right? So they don't know about Fakhr, but they know about Ibn Sina.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the kind of historical dimension of it. I think the philosophical dimension of it is that you can actually relate a lot of this to contemporary discussions in metaphysics. So, I mean, obviously, very little of what I just said is like important in day-to-day life, as it were. But actually, essentialism is still a big issue in contemporary metaphysics. And Ibn Sina has the most sophisticated version of essentialism in Islamic philosophy. So looking at how people responded to that actually, I think, is quite relevant to contemporary metaphysics.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. One question is, how would Ibn Sina interpret various positive descriptions or attributes of God in, let's say, the Quran? Would these be metaphors?
They would. I think he wouldn't say that they're metaphors. He would. I mean, that's certainly a view you get in some thinkers, but it doesn't seem to be his strategy. His strategy is to say that although they may look like straightforward positive attributes, in fact, they are either negations or relations. So, for example, if you say God is powerful, that may look as if you're ascribing power to God, and that power is an attribute of God, which belongs to him the way that, my baldness belongs to me, let's say. But in fact, Ibn Sina would say that even though the linguistic presentation of this is that God has power and is therefore powerful, in fact, what it really means is that God has caused other things to exist and is powerful only in the sense that they come from him, right? So it's actually more a statement about the things he's caused to exist than a statement about God. You're saying, really, when you say God is powerful, what that means is not that God has power, but that everything else derives from God. Mm-hmm. And similarly, if you say God is necessary, that looks like you're saying God has an attribute of necessity, but actually it just means that God has no cause. So it's a negation. So it's sort of like the positive attributes. It's like the packaging looks like a positive attribute, but when you open up the package, inside is a negation or a relation. Which, by the way, is exactly what the Mu'tazilites would say.
We're running out of time. Maybe two more questions. Is that okay?
Yeah, whatever.
Okay. So where would Ibn Arabi fit in with regard to how you're comparing Ibn Sina and Fakhr Razi? Is Ibn Arabi unique compared to Ibn Sina and Razi, or does he lean toward one or the other with regard to his view of God?
Okay, so there's a complicated historical question about how much Ibn Arabi knew about Ibn Sina and how influenced he was by him. I think where to put Ibn Arabi on this spectrum we've just seen is much closer to Ibn Sina than Fakhr. So actually, Ibn Arabi is also very strongly influenced by the Mu'tazila, and he's got a very strong view of divine simplicity, right? So for him, God is pure existence. That's just Ibn Sina's position. And thus, I mean, if you only sort of lay out the two options I laid out in this talk, God is pure existence, God is an essence plus a bunch of attributes, basically Ibn Arabi just agrees with Ibn Sina, which is presumably not a coincidence, right? So he's presumably influenced by him in that respect. But of course, he's also agreeing with Mu'tazila there. So there's kind of historical problem there of teasing, since Ibn Sina's effectively agreeing with the Mu'tazila as well. There's kind of a historical question about how much Mu'tazilism is the driving force in both cases, right? Mm-hmm. The difference, though, is, as I said before, Ibn Arabi would then go a further step that Ibn Sina does not take, which is to say, well, if God is pure existence, then nothing else really exists, right? So everything ultimately is unified within God. The universe is just the kind of appearances of God or the manifestations or names of God. And ultimately, what we're trying to do in Sufism is realizing the unity of ourselves and all things with God, which is not in any way an Avicennan position. So it's really the next step that he takes that makes him drift further away from Ibn Sina than Fakhr ever goes away from Ibn Sina.
Okay, last question, and I think this is one that will actually benefit everyone. Are there any foundational works, books, articles that could help us understand these arguments from a beginner's perspective?
Yes, so glad you asked. So I mentioned Fedor Benovich during the talk, and this is a book that he and I did together. So it's called The Heirs of Avicenna, Philosophy in the Islamic East, 12th and 13th centuries. This is actually the first of 3 volumes, of which 2 have already appeared. And there are chapters in here on the essence, existence distinction, divine attributes, and so on. So what this, you can see, it's quite a big book, right? And what it gives you is quotations of short passages, usually from Ibn Sina and a whole bunch of other thinkers who follow in his wake. And in every chapter, there's always some quotations from Razi because he's so important. And importantly, there's also an introduction to each chapter, which kind of explains what's going on. To be honest, the material is quite challenging often. It's pretty dense material, but that's just how it is because that's how they write. But hopefully the introduction makes it clear what's happening. And one good thing about this book is that it's open access. So you can just download it for free from the website that I think Cyrus just put in the chat. There's like I said, there's 2 volumes. So there's this volume, and there's also a volume on logic and epistemology. And there will be a 3rd volume on physics and psychology. Also, there's another website which is linked to this project, which is heirsofAvicenna.net. And that has all the Arabic texts and Persian texts that we translated. And again, that's free to download. So I'd point people to that for the post-Avicennian tradition. For Ibn Sina himself, I wrote the very short introduction to Ibn Sina for Oxford University Press. So that's like really for like beginners. It's aimed at a general audience. There's also a good general book on Avicenna, Ibn Sina by John McGuinness. So I'd recommend that as well.
So again, thank you, Professor Adamson, for joining us. Thank you, audience members, for being here, and looking forward to our next discussion. Thanks. Take care. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.